thank you for staying. I know that that's not a simple thing on a Saturday to accomplish, and it's been an intense couple of days. And not only an intense couple of days, we could argue it's been an intense period between January 28th, when this thing was originally, and the first part of my talk actually deals with that. So back in like mid-January, I had this great idea for a talk. It was called Domains in the Afterglow, What We Can Learn from GeoCities About Digital Identity. And that's what I was going to present here. And just as a kind of evidence that I'm not lying to you, I actually did that. There's the Armageddon. I don't know if you can see that piece. What the hell is the Afterglow? I talk about that. Bruce, right? There's GIFs. I talk about the archive team, going through them. There's the 1 terabyte GeoCities, the dancing baby, of course, GeoCities FAQ. And I go through this, and I gave this presentation 4 times since then. So it's kind of like I feel like not only burned out on it a little bit, but I feel like I could, you know what I mean? So I'm kind of going to give it to you in fast motion. UMW, DS-16, the greatest class ever. DS-16, whoa, wait, look at that. And then we go back, Dr. Oblivion, big fan. The domains, hey, really innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it, something we've done before. Hey, here's how it works. Tim talking about that, Mom talking about that, we're talking about that. You've seen this. I'll come back to him. But this, students, victory, yay, look, more. Oh, that was a beautiful site. We didn't see the Galapagos, doing on UNW domains, big fan. Student sites, no, faculty sites. Wrigley great research site. Scholars, talked about that. Century America. All right. And then stop the video. That was my talk. Yay! So you're done, right? And I couldn't bring myself to bring it again, no less because when I saw Audrey, laying it all down, I was like, I gotta find another way to approach this whole thing. And not as kind of an avoidance technique, but we've been here for 2 days. A lot of what I would talk about there was kind of geared towards a group of people who hadn't gone through it or heard about it or seen it. So I went back to the drawing board a little bit, and in all honesty, I kind of returned to a presentation I failed at in May of 2013, so a year ago. I tried to give a presentation on this idea of coherence to the campus technology. It was provosts and presidents. And I was trying to do it through a phone system. And they said, you're going to present through a phone system and look at the screen. And so I had it on speakerphone. And they're like, okay, now you can play your audio. And I tried to get it off speakerphone, and every time I kept on hanging up. So I had to dial back into the session 6 times. And then finally they were like, you're done. We're done with it. So I said, I started hearing about what we were talking about the last 2 days. And the issues that were coming up for me and for us, and I hope for a community. And I said, you know what, I'm going to return to that talk today. And I'm going to kind of go through it. And it's a particular kind of talk, and I'm just setting you up for it. It's a talk that is predicated on another talk. So it's a talk that prays off a talk by John Udell given in 2007. And it's the talk that has kind of inspired me for the last 7 or 8 years to chase after this thing I haven't really been able to articulate until maybe the last year and arguably the last 2 days. And so it's an important talk that he gave that I want to kind of, move to. Now, Audrey said something yesterday about smart-ass remarks and Seinfeld.
I was everywhere. I couldn't find that picture.
And I actually just wanted to be clear. I don't know what she's talking about. Big fan. Okay. So let's go, right? Enough of this playing around. Domain of one's own, problem of coherence. One of the things that's come up and that I really want to start struggling with is this notion of coherence. Coherence between the systems that we understand with the LMS, the vision of how we do our work, how we gather those analytics, how we understand how we teach and learn within these systems, and this kind of distributed nodal approach that we're talking about with domain of one's own. And that tension is very real, and it needs to be, and it should be. And I also don't want to pretend like this ground hasn't been covered before, because it has. And not only by John Udell, but he's just one example. of a thinker who's kind of been struggling with the tensions between what he's talking about as monolithic IT systems and the vast, loose, cheap, distributed, out-of-control technology, which we could call blogs, social media, or even now domains. He actually refers to a he in this talk, in this 2-minute clip I'm going to play. And the he he's referring to, interestingly enough, is Mike Caulfield. So anyone who knows Mike Caulfield, when Udell talks about the he here, oh, that's for you, Clay. When Udell talks about the
brutally
he here,
apparent to
talking
him
about Caulfield.
that a lot of things that formerly seemed only possible in the context of relatively monolithic kinds of IT systems are now creeping in from the edge, just like you were saying, the PC kind of crept in from the edge 20 years ago, right? We're seeing that sort of a turn in the cycle of history again. And he just so wants to go with that, right? He so wants it to be the case that the university can embrace this kind of loosely coupled, syndicated world, right? Where we didn't have to necessarily build the blogging system that you're using or the content management system or this, that, or the other piece, because these things really do interoperate, and students really can come to these things in an extremely lightweight way and use them really on their own with little overt support from us. And that's not flying. He's not making the case. And he's not making the case for valid reasons, which is that as things stand today, it's from the perspective of his bosses, the people that run IT and the people that run the university, there's a coherence problem with this kind of loose arrangement. In theory, yeah, all the student really needs to do is communicate to the school, this is the work that I've done at these URLs, and it's a network, and everything's interoperable over HTTP, and it all sort of works. And it all does sort of work, but that seems to be the problem, right? There are no sort of enterprise-y service guarantees that are available.
And I think here in this 2-minute clip, Udell does a really good job of setting up one of the issues we face right away when we're talking about domain control. If we're looking for something that's going to replace the LMS, or that's going to provide this enterprise-like coherence, we're not going to find it. And that's something, A, we got to get comfortable with, but B, I think also as we talk about reclaim your domain, as we talk about domain of one's own, we also have to struggle with what is going to work and what is going to get people to adopt this. And I think that's an issue we really have to kind of deal with. Clay talked about this notion of what you think about when you think about coherence. And this is a great image that he suggested, and it's this image of balancing all these different services so they actually look like, some sort of lattice that makes sense. And whether it be Flickr, Google+, your own domain, the university CMS, how do you balance all that? How do you kind of start to draw out the tension between the monolithic IT system and your own personal space? And Udell does a really good job of starting to get into this discussion. And one of the things he talks about at the beginning that kind of takes us back historically a little bit is Gordon Bell's experiment of life bits. And I don't know if you've heard about Gordon Bell's experiment, but just listen to this clip.
Right? And so they're sort of at loggerheads, they're not really getting past this. And I have been proposing to various people that there is an architecture which will kind of help us break this logjam. And this is very speculative and it doesn't exist today. I can't point you to examples of it. And I can't prove that it's going to come to pass. But I have a feeling that it will, and I have, for what it's worth, a decent track record in terms of predicting these kinds of things. So this scenario that I'm envisioning, I've started to call hosted life bits. And the life bits part of it comes from Gordon Bell, who's actually a Microsoft researcher now, a former famous computer designer. And you guys may have heard about this or read, actually recently there was an article in the New York Times about his life bits project. And so, Gordon's project is basically to create this archive of all of the digital assets related to his life, going all the way back as far as scannable documents are available, but also moving forward in an era where there's high bandwidth networking and storage, and so he's actually capturing, close to real time, a sort of a digital log of his life, right? That's an interesting idea, I think, to all of us. It kind of harkens back to the Vannevar Bush Memex concept. But when I say hosted life bits, I'm talking about something that to me is very different in the sense that it's, when I say hosted, it lives in the cloud, right? So this digital archive of mine is not some sort of thing that's attached to my computer or that lives on storage that only I can access, but rather is a repository of my life work that exists in a place where it can participate in relationships with other people's repositories and with other people.
Does this sound at all familiar to some of the stuff we're talking about right now? The tensions, right? And I actually brought Udell out, not because I wanted to phone it in on this talk, although that's part of it. I actually brought him back because he's someone I constantly study for trying to communicate what seems like a very technical, difficult idea to just about anyone. And if I think about reclaim your domain or domain of one's own, it's that educational communication divide that I'm trying to conquer right now. And it's why this trip has been so unbelievably useful. Gordon Bell actually wrote a book about that process last year. It was called Total Recall. And I went to the blog as I was preparing this talk, and one of the things that I found really interesting, and this is a post from July 25th, 2013, is this site, socialsafe.net. Regaining ownership of the data of your life from all those social sites, right? Talking about Julian Ranger, the founder and CIO of Social Safe. And it's interesting. Kin said it, and Audrey said it in the last session. This stuff is in the air right now. What we're doing and what we're talking about with domain of one's own is one small part of a much larger conversation that's happening. And it's interesting that where maybe one interface for us is the educational space. And because Udell in 2007, when he was giving this talk, was giving it for an EDUCAUSE session, framed it interesting ways for education. So I want to go to this next bit where he talks, I think he starts to talk about little Susie. And this is what I think talks about the lifetime personal digital archive, and he talks about this figure of little Susie, just an imaginary kid out there. And for me, this is really something I've been trying to communicate and come back to again.
Well, let's start at the beginning. So Susie is born, and Susie gets a social security number, and Susie also gets some sort of a digital token, which is a handle to this space in the cloud, which is going to be, in fact, her lifetime digital archive.
That's Susie.
So a couple years later, Susie shows up in kindergarten, and she makes a finger painting, and the teacher says, let's put the finger painting up on the school website, along with the other kids' stuff so everyone can see. And you know how that would happen now. The teacher would collect all the photos, they would upload them probably to their content management system, and they would be there for a couple of years, and then they'll go away, right? Because the school's just not going to be in the business of guaranteeing any sort of reliable, permanent, durable access to that archive of stuff. What if, on the other hand, though, when the teacher says, Susie, let's take a picture of your stuff, she also says, give me your token, Susie, and she sticks the token in her camera, and the photos go up to Susie's archive, which is being managed for her by some service, which we'll speculate more about later, but is being managed in a really serious and robust way, really secure, safe, long-term way. The school, from its point of view, gets the same effect, but they get it by way of syndication, right? So they don't now have to store the photo. All they have to do is refer to the photo. And of course you can do that today, but again, you're back to that volatility problem, that coherence problem, right? Which is that, what is the likelihood that if 30 students have random stuff, on 15 different blogging and photo sharing services, that I'm going to get a coherent result when I syndicate all that in, right? Because, just as it's not right now in the business model of the school to necessarily guarantee any kind of real permanence and reliability, it's also not in the interest of really any of today's breed of personal publishing services. I think that can change big time. I think that it will change. I think it's going to be a huge business opportunity. And I think that there's a lot of forces that are working in that direction. So if you kind of play this forward, you get to fourth grade with Susie, and she does a science project, and the science project is a poster And, so same thing. She submits her poster, the PDFs, and maybe a video or an audio, and it's up there in her archive, and it syndicates to, where it needs to be for the e-portfolio or where it needs to be in order to be assessed. Because I guess ultimately what the school is really doing when they assess and measure stuff is assigning metadata, really, and that it seems can be decoupled from the responsibility of primary management of storage. But, if it were just school stuff, it wouldn't be that compelling. But, at the same time, right, in 5th grade, Susie breaks her elbow and she gets an x-ray taken. And guess where the x-ray winds up, right? In the same place, okay? Because, we're going to get there. I mean, I believe I will live long enough to see that we will get there, right? And we will actually have coherent personal digital archives that include, our educational records, our financial records, and our medical records.
And this is, to me, that whole clip is the closest I've ever heard to the articulation of this notion of a coherent personal digital archive. And it's how I kind of got into hosting in 2003 when my son, well, soon before my son was born. I used that as a place to start uploading his images, his videos, to share it with my family back in Italy, and to just basically build an archive for my son. And it's fascinating to hear about little Susie and hear about little Susie's journey, and to think about, yes, this is one way in, the portal through education. But what he kind of struggles with, Udell, and why I kind of love this talk so much, is you hear him at the end. He's like, we will get there. I'm telling you we will, but he's almost trying to convince himself, right? Because he's talking about these third-party services that actually it's not part of their business plan. He's saying we could use these relative links, but that seems, the coherence of integrating and aggregating all these different blogging platforms is not consistent. And he's searching for some space that notion of coherence, even if it's somewhat illusory for the user and provided by a service, exists. And I'm fascinated by this because little Susie's personal digital archive and her relationship to all of this data has started to, again, recircle in this room. We're talking about electrical data, right? Kim's talking about sitting down with people from various electrical companies in California to deal with how are they going to get people their electrical data? How are we going to get your school data? How are we going to get this forms of data? Have we even thought at all about what those infrastructures look like and how those personal cyber infrastructures work? And it's interesting because domain of one's own is happening to some degree at a few institutions, and it's not a movement. Again, we pretend it's a movement just yet at a few institutions, but the implications of it move far beyond that. The implications of it, I think, are far bigger, and what excites me, and sure, it starts with Susie, and you always say, I'm doing it for the kids, right? But it's interesting that it's not, and I don't think it will be, and I don't mean to disrupt kind of some of the stuff we were talking about here in the last day or so, I don't think it will be a federation of schools. I don't think this is where we're going to break big here, right? And I'm going to, again,
to Susie and her school records and her health records, what does the federation that is going to make those guarantees on her behalf look like? And I don't think it looks like a federation of schools, because this is a lifelong thing that we're talking about, right? And she's going to move through multiple schools. She's going to move through multiple employment situations. We really do need and want to get to a scenario where her personal life record and work record is this portable thing, right? Which can reliably interoperate as she moves through all of these phases, but which is being managed in a way that ultimately none of those entities, I think, have the business incentive to assure. Because ultimately, we care about our own stuff more than anyone else is going to care about our stuff for us. I think that, we will be very happy to pay for some tiered levels of service that at various price points give us assurances about your stuff is coherent for 10 years, or your stuff, is going to be accessible to your grandchildren. I mean, I think about this a lot because I've got Keynote kids who I've taken a bunch of photos of over the last, since kind of digital cameras came in, so whatever, the last 8 or so years, right? It's just really unclear, whether the digital photos that I've taken over the last 8 years of my kids are going to be around for their kids in the same way that the stuff in the shoebox that is the pictures of my parents' parents is available to me, right? We just don't have any sort of coherent sort of system here for everybody.
Yeah, and it's, again, going back to this question of the Federation of Schools, and going back to this question of little Susie, and the notion now of the digital archive. And who cares about your archive? Who's controlling it? Where does that domain, and where do you reclaim it, and how do you reclaim it? And what I think is interesting to think about, and it's a discussion again we've had over the last day or two, is does UMW put itself, or does Emory put itself in the position of caring about these students' domains? The question has come up again and again, like, what happens when they leave? What happens if they decide not to use it? And one of the things I think we really have to think about strongly is, as we approach this institutionally, what's our relationship to the student's data? What's our relationship to that personal lifetime archive? And he brings up the question in the course of this discussion, and I think he brings it up here, and he might bring it up again, as a service. And a service that we would pay for cohesion. How much would you pay to say that for the next 100 years, I know those digital photos that he doesn't know will be around, will be around? Like, who would you pay and how would you pay for your digital legacy? And it's an interesting question, right? We've heard about it in the WordPress plugin and what happens when you go. Like, who closes down your site? Who manages your domain? Where do all those images go? And it's funny that the question that's a simple question about how do we kind of empower students to think about digital literacy actually moves out into just about every element of our life. Or our death, or our legacy, or who we are. I started blogging not because I'm interested in education. I started blogging as a way to deal with the fact that my parents didn't take a picture of me before I was like 8, because there were 7 of us. And I was like, I'm going to take every picture. I'm going to make sure it lives in 5 different places. And I'm not going to have the kid problem where that hard drive dies. Right? I'm going to make sure it's there. And that was about personal archiving. But it was interesting that once you step into that space and you start to realize how it works, it's also about how much of this stuff do I truly own? How much of it can I claim? And how ephemeral is it? Like, should I be having the pictures in the shoebox? Like, that shoebox idea is interesting. It's like the idea of the Raspberry Pi in your house with all of your data. Like, perhaps that's where I go. Right? I mean, it's not clear. Now, one of the things I do, and I do regularly around this idea, or I've been doing around what I think is the culmination, well, maybe not the culmination, but the culmination, at least the current, how would I say it? The current vision, the current instantiation, maybe is the best way to talk about, of this work that's been going on for 10 years. So I think I've pretty much been doing one thing for 10 years. Alongside Martha and Jerry Slazak and Gardner Campbell and Patrick Murray-John, I mean, not just me, we've been doing kind of one thing for 10 years. UMW Domains, or Domain of One's Own, is kind of where that's at this moment. We've been using Web 2.0 tools, we've been using social media to empower students to think about taking back some of the work they do, to owning it in different ways, to live outside the LMS. Because the LMS, and basically, it's a Roche Motel, right? Everything that goes in doesn't come out. Right? Seriously, I mean, that's what it is. And so, when you think about that, you think about the relationship to teaching and learning, it can happen there. But there's no sense of the student's relationship to the work they did, and then to the connections on the web, and it goes on and on. So one of the things we started this with, and this is when I started at Mary Washington, was this idea of everything you do, you narrate. You tell the story. Right? And it was kind of a very easy transition for me, because I was already doing that with the birth of my son. I was narrating every element of his life for different reasons, kind of more like Truman Show reasons, but at the same time, it was happening.
Notion of what is personal publishing and personal archiving. What does this really mean in terms of the advancement of, among other things, the academic enterprise of research and collaboration? Because it had always struck me, ever since I started blogging, how it was such a natural fit for what actually goes on in the academic world. And yet it seemed that few academics were really embracing this mode of communication. There are certainly shining examples, and more edu-blogging is going on. And so I don't mean to diminish that in any way. But I have heard the following comment a number of times from different people. And the comment was in response to, so do you narrate the work that you do on a blog, and is that an interactive process? Up to the point where, let's say, you produce a peer-reviewed publication, right? Is the upstream part of that something that is visible and interactive? And a lot of people said no, and they said no because this phrase came up a number of times. I don't want to put half-baked ideas out there, right? I want to know that I'm right. And I had a really hard time wrapping my head around that, because in my world, so in sort of wearing different professional hats, I've used my blog in the same way, and I've used it as this kind of exploratory probe to put ideas out that are half-baked, not fully formed, precisely because I'm inviting the kind of interaction which I then have received in spades, which has helped me immeasurably to refine my thinking.
And it's interesting that resistance I had earlier to talk about this work as the culmination of anything is that every time we got to another stage, people brought it up, this notion of UMW blogs, this notion of DS-106. When you get to that new stage, a new kind of possibility opens up before you very soon. And so we've moved from, say, something like the Bluehost experiment to UMW blogs, which was our blogging platform, to digital storytelling, DS-106, to what is now domain of one's own. But at every point, the only thing that hasn't changed is that ethos of what does it mean with this technology that we hear so much about, how it's liberating, how it's democratizing. How has that changed not only the way in which we teach and learn, but the way in which students relate to the work they've done? It hasn't. I mean, we can ask a real question like, has it? I think at Mary Washington, it's changed somewhat. We have like 660 maybe examples of students who are actually thinking about this. And we're held up as like a model, when we should be like what's happening everywhere, right? I mean, it's amazing how much we've become indentured to this notion of the monolithic systems. And when that tension is brought up, it's absolutely default to coherence. And it's a kind of scary reality we find ourselves in. And it actually goes back to something we've talked about and has come up again and again, this question of online identity and controlling, or even if you can control your identity. And
the notion of narrating one's own story online, because we're doing it anyway, or if we're not, it's being done to us, is the thing. Right? This is the world that we're now in forevermore. Is that to the overwhelming majority, to the 99.999, 69% of humanity, you are what the search engines find when someone puts your name in. Do you or do you not want to participate in that narrative? To that article, right? So there's no technical solution to preventing a reputation attack, but there is the possibility of at least asserting your own, again, representation of yourself, right? Which can, if it coexists with that other stuff, powerfully counteract it. The generation of parents and teachers have, in some sense, abdicated what could be a leadership role and a teaching role in this situation, right? Because what the messages that you hear from parents and teachers and educators about things like, in particular, MySpace and Facebook, is be afraid, look at all the ways you can screw up, right? Look at all the ways you can do something that'll dog you for the rest of your life, okay? And that message is out there in spades. I saw a TV commercial recently when I was out in Redmond. I don't know if it's been around elsewhere. There's a teenage girl walking around town, and all these strangers come up to her and they say, "Hey, nice pink T-shirt," and stuff. And like people have been like stalking her through her postings and know all this stuff about her, right? And the tagline was "Think before you post," right? So all of that messaging is out there. But where is the message that says, "Here's how to do it right. Here's how to do it in a responsible and a professional way, in a way that is in tune with your lifelong interests, right? And your professional goals."
I mean, I couldn't say that better. In terms of the notion of how we've abdicated our relationship to these literacies, how we've used fear, uncertainty, and doubt to shut down any discussion around them at our universities, and how I do truly believe, and I don't want to kind of suggest otherwise, that domain of one's own is one way at that. Although I think in 2014, depending upon the age-old discussion with our institutions about the LMS or is a dangerous road to take. It's one that scares me. This is 7.5 years ago, almost 8 years ago, that UDEL has laid out everything we're talking about these last 2 days. None of this is new. We are not cutting new ground at all. Just like domain of one's own is not cutting new ground. It was possible in 2003, 2002. And it struck me over the last 2 days just how much we're in this bubble. And how much that bubble is getting less and less oxygen. It's becoming more and more suffocating. And I was interested, one of the other really interesting points Udell made.
Observation 3 times so far in the comments,
again.
people have made observations that of the government having access to our information. And I'm sort of curious, are we really that much more comfortable with large corporations having access to our information? Or is that as big a concern to people?
Well, if it were a big concern to people, I don't think Gmail would be very popular. So that's an existence proof, right? That the digital ID card debate, right, is very amazing because we're in the U.S. It's like no digital ID cards, but no privacy laws, right? I met the guy that's rolling out the digital IDs in Belgium to like 10,000 people a week. They're going to have the whole country covered in a few years. I mean, they're all over it from a different perspective, right? Which is the citizens actually have some trust in the government's caring about the privacy issue. So it's one of those deals.
And that's something that really scares me right now, is this notion of the digital ID discussion that's happening in Belgium because the people trust. And when I talk to Ken, I both get very enthusiastic and very scared at the same time. I get petrified and scared. In fact, I think Audrey came off as the rainbows and unicorns one at this point because in some ways, I think there is this sense that we can take away the cobblestones and find the beach. At the same time, when you think about this kind of digital ID, this kind of token that he was talking about with young Susie, that you could point into the digital camera and she would have some protected space, maybe hosted by the government. Do you think we could even imagine having that conversation right now in the US? Right? The survivalists would come out from every corner. Right? The black helicopter people would be up there with shotguns and machine guns. I mean, it's interesting where in just 7.5 short years, even a discussion about a digital identity may be provided by the federal government, which I think is kind of what Udell was pointing to at some points, is almost an impossibility. Because we have no trust. Right? There's no trust in each other. There's no trust in our government. The idea that we keep on wrapping our mind around this notion of community that we don't even trust, and that we want this to happen, suggests that, at least we want something, but it's a bleak, bleak vision, if you think about it enough.
Way of thinking and doing in the realm of personal publishing is about, once you decide the kind of contribution that you make, how effective are you going to be able to be, right? And being effective has a whole lot to do with how consistently and coherently can I communicate what I'm trying to do? How effectively can I figure out who else is operating in the same space, become aware of what they're doing, and federate my my actions with theirs, to pool our efforts. And, so all of this, it always comes back to collaboration for me, and that was kind of the touchstone. That was what my book was about. Was the sort of the perception that we can actually, really work together in some profoundly new ways, and we can do more and achieve more, because we can network our minds together into teams, and that I think is for me, it's always been the core message, right?
And it's interesting, that's the final audio clip. And that's a good way to stop in some ways to talk about this notion of consistency and coherence of message. That is something this group has to think about really hard. And the other thing this group has to think about really hard is what does it mean in relationship to how do we want to accomplish this? I actually think the roadmap laid out by Audrey and Kin is pretty clear. I mean, they've crystallized the vision, and there's a certain amount of tech there in terms of reclaim your domain. I think the domain of one's own, if you look at the work Tim and Martha did, and the unbelievable examples that David provided us through Emory, that's there. I mean, that's on the ground. You can see examples. Domain of one's own will be an unbelievable failure, though, if it stops there. And I don't just mean in terms of a project that UMW dreamed up as a vision. I mean as a cultural possibility and moment to start taking back some of the things that are ours. Some of the things that by right we need as a community to stand up for. And I go back to Udell because this is a conversation that's waning now. And it's a conversation that's waning in some really, almost for me, some distressing ways. Because it seems like people can applaud the work we're doing at UMW, but I just feel this unbelievable sense of urgency around other people starting to realize it's possible, but then people coming together and saying, let's do it, despite what comes of it. And that's it. That's all I have to say.